I would investigate. Yeah. Then probably then we could integrate. Yeah. Keep your eyes on the prize.
In the years following World War II, African Americans were growing tired of the same old calls for patience. Backed by the Cold War rhetoric that spoke of the United States as the land of liberty and equality, and by the economic gains that they had made since the end of the Great Depression, African Americans mobilized to end the American South's system of racial segregation and discrimination. After the war, NAACP lawyers mounted a constitutional challenge on segregation in the nation's schools on the grounds that separate education was inherently unequal. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court agreed. The court ruled that to separate children in school solely because of their race generates feelings of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. The Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. After close to a half century, separate but equal was no longer the law of the land. In the years following Brown versus the Board of Education, African Americans in the South began to openly challenge segregation. In December 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And a young minister by the name of Martin Luther King led black citizens in a year-long boycott of the city's buses. In December 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama laws segregating black passengers on public transportation was unconstitutional. The next year, Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction to protect African Americans' ability to vote. White supremacists in the South struck back, organizing white citizens' councils to resist integration.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will. I believe in the democratic processes and principles of government wherein the people determine the problems on the local level, which is their right.
In the fall of 1957, a federal court ordered school authorities in Little Rock, Arkansas, to admit 9 black students to the all-white Central High School. One of them was Elizabeth Eckford.
I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face. But when I looked at her again, she spat on me. Elizabeth Eckford.
President Dwight D. Eisenhower preferred a gradualist approach to integration. But when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus refused to allow Elizabeth Eckford and the other black students to enter Central High, Eisenhower sent federal troops to make sure that integration took place as the law demanded. In the following years, the civil rights movement would transform American society, dismantling the system of racial segregation that had been in existence for more than 80 years. African Americans were not the only people seeking change. American intellectuals, artists, and youths were also beginning to rebel against the consensus and conformity of the post-war world. For decades, Americans had believed that the return of prosperity would make the American dream a reality. But not everyone was happy. Rejecting artistic conventions, artists called abstract expressionists turned to their unconscious minds for inspiration. Novels like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man gave white Americans a glimpse into the psychological costs of racial segregation. J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye told of the alienation of American kids from adult society. Teenage unhappiness in the midst of plenty expressed itself in rebellious behavior. And most alarming of all was that more and more of the young rebels without a cause came not from America's impoverished inner cities, but were middle-class kids from the suburbs. In the mid-1950s, Congress held hearings on yet another threat to the nation's future, juvenile delinquency, which expert witnesses insisted was caused by the evil influences of comic books, motion pictures, and other mass media. In the 1950s, teenagers found a new soundtrack for their lives in a music that emerged, like jazz before it, from the world of African Americans. They called it rock and roll. Other youthful rebels called beatniks criticized Americans' conformity and addiction to consumer goods. They wanted nothing to do with the organization man or middle-class suburbanites who lived dull lives of drab sameness. To the beatniks, affluence had not brought fulfillment of the American dream, but faceless conformity and a deadening of the human spirit. The end of World War II had ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity. Economic growth spurred by technological advances had transformed many Americans' lives. But affluence had not solved all of the nation's problems. Even as post-war families raised their children and pursued their American dreams, movements for reform and rebellion were already taking shape and gaining momentum. In the 1960s, the United States would enter a new era of conflict and reform, an era in which Americans would again struggle to achieve freedom and justice for all.